Okay, welcome everyone. As people are entering the room, we will be starting the last speaker series for this year. And I am happy to be handing this over for an introduction to Shyam from the Department of Biomedical Informatics. They have a strong program in machine learning and computational biology. And I thought I would let Shyam do the introduction for John Kalafut. Shyam.
Thank you, Adrian. I'm indeed very pleased to introduce Dr. John Kalafut, who is the speaker for today. He's the CEO and founder of Azure Orion Group that is located in Pittsburgh. And this is a firm that is relatively new. It provides advice, services, and solutions for digital health and medical AI solutions. So John got a Bachelor's of Science in Electrical Engineering, as well as in physics from the University of Scranton. He followed that up at the University of Pittsburgh with a master's in electrical engineering, and then a PhD in electrical and computer engineering with a bioengineering minor. He focused during his PhD work on personalized delivery of contrast material at computed tomographic angiography. And as you can guess from that, that's the area of the focus of his research. After his doctoral work, he was the Director of Informatics Research and Strategy at Medrad, which is a local company, which developed injector technology for CT and magnetic resonance imaging. He then briefly worked for Bayer Healthcare and then moved on to Chicago, where he was the Chief Scientist in Digital and Informatics Research at General Electric Healthcare. He recently came back to Pittsburgh to found the Azure Orion Group. And so, as I said, his focus has been in radiology, and he has identified and built a new medical imaging IT market segment in radiation, contrast media analytics, and radiation dose tracking. And he has developed, with academic healthcare systems, AI-augmented diagnostic medical solutions. He has been granted 38 US patents, numerous publications, and has given numerous invited lectures. And today he's going to be talking about perils, pitfalls, and solutions, crossing the translational chasm with machine learning algorithms for diagnostic medicine. And before I hand it off to him, please type your questions in the chat box, and we'll get to them at the end of his talk. So on to John.
Well, thank you very much, Shyam, and thank you, Dr. Lee, and everyone for the invitation and the honor to speak to you. And great to be the last one for the year 2021. As you heard, part of what I've been doing this past year, I decided to leave the confines of corporate world of product development, management, applied research, and start my own organization, largely because of the activities for the last 10 years where I've gotten very involved in large scale informatics, especially informatics IT, and really regulated software as a medical device. So I've had product management leadership roles when I was part of GE Healthcare in imaging IT, PACS, radiology, cardiology. And then as we transition, part of the strategy that we looked at in terms of, well, all this machine learning, quote unquote, AI was becoming very, very vogue, right? Especially when IBM Watson was becoming in the press every day, and ImageNet was breaking news. So as an organization, part of what we had strove to do was, well, let's not just focus on the technology, but let's use the construct of open innovation, work very closely with academic and community and government agencies and organizations to develop, co-develop, co-create solutions that are not just for publication or not just for research, but that you ultimately want to bring into the medical device portfolio for global delivery. So being in that position, and then my broader career of building medical devices and doing regulatory work and submission, I've really have come across and seen different models that work in terms of this innovation mindset. What does it take in terms of taking a concept, an idea from a need all the way to regulators and then out to the market. A big part of my role, one of my roles too at GE Healthcare, were global solutions management. So throughout my talk to here, I'm going to address a lot of the needs and circumstances that are present and needed to improve healthcare globally. Machine learning can be one element of it, but more broadly speaking, theme to mention is this notion of medical informatics and software engineering and computer science and diagnostic medical knowledge are all needed to come together. Because I think a lot of some of the less than optimal results that I had seen in my career were somewhat due to not having a good understanding of the big picture, of understanding the value, or of too focusing in on technology. All you need are data and some pixels, and train them and off we'll go, and we'll replace radiologists and pathologists in 10 years, right? So some of that context again for myself of going out on my own, having all that experience and knowledge, I feel like I can bring that to small companies, to providers, to government agencies. And so that is really where my passion and focus has led to. And so that's also part of what brings us here today. Obviously you can read this. Some of this is those typical materials you'll see in intro corporate level discussions, but I did want to put a box here for a second, because again, this is the Institute for Precision Medicine. And I think from a vendor industry perspective, there is the precision medicine definition that I think many of you would recognize and acknowledge in terms of molecular chemistry, molecular medicine, and cellular interactions. But then there's also this buzzword use of precision medicine at the marketing level for medical device companies, IT companies, digital health companies. In my perspective, being enmeshed, I've worked in pharmaceutical companies, I've worked in medical technologies, across, even not just in the imaging world, but in clinical care, critical care. I think an operative definition of precision medicine definitely has to include the genetic molecular component, definitely, right? But the idea about, though, being able to better make a diagnosis or interpretation as soon as you can, the first time, and then leading that to better treatment decisions and reducing that iteration, right? And that minimizing the trial and error, I think, is a key thing. The recognition is there's always going to be that trial and error, right? Medicine is by no stretch a solved discipline. I always chuckle a bit of these digital twin type of concepts, like we'll make a digital twin with enough data. I was like, well, we'd be living to be 1,000 years old, right? If it was just a matter of being able to model and understand data trends in patients, right? So there's always going to be that variability. There's always going to be unknowns, but this is where data-driven innovation should help and should have a play. As also too, we all know globally the stresses on the healthcare systems, both from booming populations, reduction in funding. How is it that we can address these existential needs for the healthcare system for the betterment of the population, right? And arguably, one hypothesis is, well, how do we liberate and create value, right, from data? It's not just as Judea Pearl, right, the famous mathematician, would say, data are profoundly dumb, right? But it's what you want to do with those data. How do you apply them? What are those insights? And then most effectively bring to some decision and then cause change. So I think as a community, again, a shared community, because it's not just about radiologists or pathologists or computer science. It's really a team sport to recognize the value and bring these into the clinic or into the distributed health systems. And especially when you start thinking about what is it that the human brain is not that good at, right? We're not good at intercepting and pulling together disparate streams of data. We're good at inferencing, right? We're good at experiential learning and knowledge and insight. So part of what, when we get to the back end of this talk, right, I'll make the point that, well, this is where we should be focusing not just only our engineering efforts in terms of translating into the market, into the product space, but also in terms of problems that we choose to work on, even as researchers and earlier on. I pulled this up, I think, for probably half this audience. This is nothing new, but I copied this somewhat from some of my friends at the American College of Radiology, the Data Science Institute, and we kind of put some of this together a few years ago when trying to explain to the broader set of radiologists in particular, well, what is this AI? And I think everybody today is sort of sick of hearing the term. I'm very much of the mindset of Michael Jordan, not Michael Jordan, basketball player, right? But the Berkeley, the electrical engineer, statistician. Like, we got to stop calling everything AI, right? And again, as a graduate student in the early 2000s, late 90s, as an electrical engineering student, I took 3 credit courses in a lot of these areas, right? I wouldn't consider myself back then, because the word didn't exist, a data scientist, right? It was part of, the discipline of electrical engineering, right? There was the same thing in biostatistics. And so this notion, I think, where we are moving towards today, we're in this in-between spot of maybe we're evolving towards some new type of engineering discipline, right? It's not necessarily electrical engineering. It's not really computer engineering. It's not applied statistics. So, similar to how chemical engineering and chemistry, electrical engineering evolved. So as an operative definition, why I put this in quotes, is, well, there's all of this, this theoretic underpinnings and framework. And now the issue is, well, how do we start applying these? And again, and for most of us that have been in this area, these types of applications are nothing new. I used to go to the SPIE meetings back in the mid 2000s, and there was like 45 people there. Today, there's thousands, right? So a lot of this too is driven by the availability of compute and the availability of data sets, and and the theoretical breakthroughs. So I don't want to be complete curmudgeon, but again, I think that it's important for understanding the landscape, especially as more of a coming in from a clinical perspective or from a precision medicine. Well, there are multiple methods, and part of the art of engineering is really understanding what are the most applicable methods to apply to solve a problem. How do you know what problem to solve? That is one of the biggest issues, I would say, and I contend that many, medically technology-oriented companies, vendors, startups struggle with. And this, again, I think, getting back to this theme of medical informatics and crossing that chasm, how do you translate and understand the whole construct of thinking about medicine and health, translating that into something that you need to use and build solutions for? And you have to think about and understand, well, how is it that medicine is practiced as it is? I use this example here for those of you who are maybe not radiologists or not experienced with radiology. I like to explain sometimes to more lay audience, well, what is a radiologist? Well, a radiologist is an expert pathophysiologist, functional anatomist that understands physics and how to use physics to generate some view and visibility of the human body, right? Technically speaking, if you really want to get semantically deep, radiologists typically don't truly make the full quote unquote diagnosis, right? They're interpreting, they're using their skill and knowledge of medicine and physiology to infer from photons and interactions and electrical magnetic waves to say, well, this is why we think is going on, right? And then with the rest of the clinical information, then you arrive at a diagnosis, right? And there is the pattern recognition. There's an experience that's learned from residency to fellowship of thousands and thousands of cases. But again, there's always this construct of understanding the context of there is physics generating these images. And I think one of the biggest challenges that I've seen, and we see, I think, frankly, I call them the first generation of AI applications that are being sold and used or tried in a lot of the clinical settings in diagnostic imaging, is the realization that there is artifact. Right? How do you account for artifact, which is extremely nonlinear, very chaotic sometimes, and many of the training sets and supervised machine learning are picked to be clear of data, of noise or error and artifact. And then as soon as you get the first brain scan, looking for a hematoma, and there's some dental streaking, the algorithm goes kaput, right? So again, that's, I think, having that context and understanding before we can build solutions that should augment and improve what human physicians or other care team members do. We need to understand, I think, what it is that the humans do, and how do we mimic or not mimic or enhance. And one of the limitations now, too, if you think about where we are and where we've been in terms of the narrow, supervised learning, deep learning paradigm. And if you think, again, if you step back to think about what is it that diagnostic radiology, pathology also does, it's again, the application here on the x-axis is the different technologies, different ways of seeing and visualizing disease structures. And then you apply these across different organ systems and different disease structures. And then there's anatomical variations, there's anatomical needs. And so when you start looking at this matrix, this interaction, well, there's going to be findings that are developed that are different, that are specific for different disease states and parts of the body. And again, part of the medical interpretation and diagnostic process is to figure out, well, well, this hyper intensity here probably means that this is happening. So therefore, doctor ordered your test, you should, do a biopsy, you should do something, right? And now the challenge, like I said, though, with think about this from a narrow supervised learning perspective, just taking the idea of taking an MRI of the knee for a posterior CL tear. Well, you're going to have to find data sets that are not only representative of the knee, but that are going to be representative of the MRI technique, maybe the field strength, maybe the gradient system, maybe the contrast, T1, T2 weighted. There are different defects, different artifacts, different views. So if you think about then from a purely supervised perspective, the need to get all of these example data sets and pull them together and annotate, have humans drawing circles on stuff and passing through convolutional neural nets, you pretty soon get to the untractable point of, okay, well, this is not going to work for quote unquote replacing what it is that the human physicians do. Can you start filling in some of these? Yes, right. And then this gets though to this point of, well, what are these use cases? What findings? What ones really could use some help? And for what part of the world and for what practices that you live in. I think what I had definitely seen through doing some very deep kind of market research and investigation, what you hear from radiologists in particular, and same thing from H&E, from diagnostic pathology is, hey, okay, there is the stupid stuff we would love automated, right? Have the tools kind of help us, like, why am I counting nuclei and cells, right? Or why am I counting lymph nodes, right, as a radiologist? Why am I measuring things with little calipers, right? So there's a whole set of problems that machine learning, again, could be really good for that don't involve finding cancer, right? And often that's hard to translate into investors or into folks that are in technology that think, well, there's just a scan that's done, and from that, you have cancer. Somebody needs that. So this context of understanding of what it is that diagnostic physicians do is critical, from developing the concept to trying to sell it, to try to get it to market through regulators. The other theme that is pretty clear through most of the market research and discovery, especially the last 5 years, was, well, give us tools to help us in subtle cases, things that we're going to equivocate on or we're going to hedge. That's where you'd think there should be, there are, I'll show an example of some work that I've been involved in. There should be some superhuman capabilities, right, of some of the technologies, because definitely we see that in research papers and in lab. But you can't claim that superhuman ability for every indication and finding in that big matrix, right? Because otherwise, if you need next 300 years to teach convolutional neural nets what to do. So this gets into this understanding that we're not just trying to find where's Waldo, right, on an X-ray or a CT or an MRI. It's about understanding what is it you're trying to answer. What's that clinical question that you're trying to solve? Sometimes the ordering physicians themselves don't know what that is, right? They're, hey, help, I need help. So how do we bring these tools together, the algorithms, the training, the right regimen, the right tools to make that possible, especially in a dynamic sense? That this is, I think, too, some of the opportunities over the next decade, is getting out of the fixed, if you will, train your convolutional neural net, you lock it in. Okay, well, hey, we're going to upload now some new training examples. Well, how do you really do that? There's a whole bunch of regulatory engineering, product questions and issues with that. But where are there opportunities, though, that allow us to use not, everything doesn't need to be deep learning, right? How do we use and choose different techniques for adaptiveness, right? For reinforcement learning paradigms, as a double E, right? We used to call this model predictive control or receding control horizon problems, right? So those, again, I think, especially as you look at even from a research perspective and grant development, where should we be skating towards? Because the reality is, like I say here, this is it's not realistic, right? As somebody that's been in the trenches, quite literally in the trenches of scan rooms, cardio, cath labs, CT suites, that there's too much variation. There's too much uncertainty that happens, right? Because especially administrators and business operation folks, like to, rightfully so, right? I'm not advocating there shouldn't be controls and metrics and analytics in healthcare operations. That's definitely the case. But the thing is, you can't just though take blindly techniques from manufacturing and say we're going to apply Six Sigma to the way that our surgical suites work, and it's always going to be the case, right? Because one of the things, and this also gets at, I think, some of the theoretic underpinnings of a lot of the techniques we use in machine learning and expanded is we know that there is going to be appropriate variation. Removing variation completely is never going to be possible because you're dealing with sick people that manifest their diseases in so many different ways. So the trick is for building this adaptive and smart system, how do you accommodate those appropriate variations, but help the care teams to make the right decisions? Like, maybe don't bring the horse in here or something. Because then from the waste comment here is like, yes, there are lots of opportunities to apply, again, machine learning driven, data driven technologies, you name it, right, to help address these issues around workflow, about disruptions. And this is too sometimes missed when you think about sometimes the zeitgeist about AI, right, in medicine. There are just as many good applications of optimization theory and numerical methods for solving scheduling, allocation issues and problems. And so in the diagnostic cockpit, if you will, right, if you think about radiologists to deal with, we have then this other challenge of broken, sometimes information streams of convoluted systems that have built up over years. And the reality is, so I found this a couple of months ago. I was doing a talk, and I dug this slide up from about 2012 about, hey, there's this issue of all these systems that don't really interoperate all that well, and information flows all over the place, right? And you can also tell, Dr. House, there's probably some people in this call don't even know who he is, but this idea, and this is put forward by Sandy Nepal in Stanford, again, back in the early 2010s. Hey, where we want to move towards, is using, what we used to call, content-based image retrieval, CAD techniques. How do we get away from just looking at pixels and drawing circles, but really trying to extract more insight from the imaging features, but also too from the clinical information that you can get access to. And then the part about, because I've seen big companies struggle with this whole idea of like, well, how do we, we should be doing something in genomics. We should be doing gene therapy, or we should be doing precision medicine. So we should buy a genetics company and put it next to our scanners, right? And like, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense necessarily, unless you think about what is it you're trying to do. And this is, I think, I'm still very passionate about this area of quantitative imaging. This notion that you can extract more quantitative insight, things, again, that you don't need to just put into a black box, right? Because biologically, you want to have some idea about, well, why do we think that this particular tumor is more malignant? All right, you can't just say, well, 14,000 layers in the ResNet thought so, right? You want to be able to trace that back to something that could have some sort of physiological, biologic resonance, right? So whether it's the texture because it's more bumpy, or there's a higher order feature of skew or kurtosis or a wavelength coefficient. And then once you start getting the quantitative aspect of this, but you need to be able to really control the input, and then how you acquire the data, how you process them. That, if you can believe, the reliability of those numbers, now you have some interesting possibilities, right, to compare these into some of your more classic or molecular metrics and pieces of information. But to get to that vision of true quantitative imaging that you can believe and trust, it takes the involvement of physicists, it takes the involvement of radiologists and pathologists. You really have to control your input. How do you actually approach and process signals, and how do you approach for repeatability? Because again, the world is nonlinear, right? As engineers, we essentially try to make a nonlinear world linear. And there is a difference when you are designing an MRI system and its imaging processing channels. Same thing for CT or ultrasound. There's a sort of a different approach you're taking when you're trying to zero in and make the image as good as possible. That's a slightly different design objective than if you're trying to acquire information out of an image space that you're going to use in some sort of quantitation or quantitative of piece. and this is, this has been kicked around in literature, and some work I've been involved with at the GE Global Research Center. Can you work, for instance, in more of the raw, what we call quote unquote raw data from MRI and CT, similar to what happens in lab medicine, right? Nobody spins a beaker around anymore and looks, for the settling of red blood cells, right? That all kind of happens inside a box and numbers come out, right? But we're still very much, we're in the nascent phase, I think, in diagnostic imaging, in that era of like, well, we're kind of still spinning the blood cells. But for us to advance into this next era, well, maybe we can again look at the original sensor data, right? What we call the sinograms in CT or K-space data. But then the question is, how do you correlate that to something physiology based? So very interesting, both theoretic challenges there, but then also clinical translation issues, which again may not end up warranting much, right? But it's important to realize that. And then this other barrier, right? I put this little screen up here is just to give the insight. Some of the reasons, right, we don't have that Dr. House vision is we deal in very large, complicated enterprise IT systems, right? The backbone of most hospitals is the radiology PACS and then the lab information systems, right? And these are dealing with tens of thousands of transactions, multi-users, concurrent issues. So it's not, and by the way, your radiology imaging management system, your PACS, that's a regulated software system, right? So you can't just willy-nilly start doing updates and changing things, or as a manufacturer, you just can't, make some new software and push it out, right? It has to be done under very measured set of controls to ensure safety. So that is a barrier, but also again, an opportunity if you think about where from the computer science evolution, computer engineering and networking. And we're starting to see that transition occur today. Not fully, I'd say healthcare operations, we're not truly fully into the cloud yet, but you really are starting to see though the embracing of container technologies and Docker Compose and Kubernetes in production level systems, right? In terms of enterprises even. So we're on that cusp, right? So it's this need, again, the needs to sort of help realize this future. It's this combination of technologies and engineering from network, computer science breakthroughs, medical insights, informatics that need to kind of pull together to sort of change the dynamic. Because this other mythology that is grown and is still a bit out there, especially as it relates to a lot of the more, say, digital health vendors or folks that come into medicine thinking, oh, we just need data. And something that I like to point out, especially as I realize now, especially more in my independent consulting world, I have many clients that are trying to work in this data aggregation or this data curation world, and again, me coming from the clinical, medical development side, I'm always like, well, wait, hey, we're not just pulling out image data, just anonymizing it, because again, that's not going to be useful for most hard problems. But however, but if you think the bigger picture, well, yeah, there are a lot of data sets that are generated in medicine and healthcare that don't have necessarily that same level of protection or risk or privacy. But I think I stole this from Medium from Travis May, the guys at Datavant. I was starting to make my own slide like this, and I figured, oh, what the hell, I'll stop. Because folks that don't have, I think, the clinical informatics, clinical IT background, they tend to think of these data sets, right? And this is what's been being transacted for a long time, right? From pharmacy information systems, from supply chain. The real challenge is though is when you get into, and again, I think even from the Datavant thing, that they talk about labs and EHR software. So there's this misperception too, I think, in the technology world that, oh, well, we're going to go talk to Epic or Cerner because they control the data, so they can somehow give us access to data, and we're going to build, just give us 2 years worth of your patient notes, and we're going to run NLP on it and find a solution, right? And there's that realization they don't understand, like, well, no, Epic Cerner is providing the technology. Those data assets, those things are within the institution. You just don't come and get those. But then there's this, I think there's this misunderstanding of what happens, especially more, and again, areas that I've been deeply involved in, right? Making machine learning algorithms out of diagnostic images, right? Or out of waveforms, or out of visible light images from slides. You cannot just apply an aggregated view of the data set and work on it, right? You need access. The people training the AI models need to look at the actual data, right? And this is then one of these interesting challenges that now arise in terms of privacy, working together with other institutions. And I'll address some of the work too they've been doing in federated learning as one technology way of helping overcome some of these challenges. But there are a few different techniques, right, for privacy preserving machine learning development. But the issue I've seen with stuff like homomorphic encryption, differential privacy, is a lot of those technologies are coming out of areas where the data developer, scientist, engineer, or the labeler don't actually need to see. Because I've had vendors come to me and say, well, why would anybody want to look at the MRI images? I'm like, because that's what we do, right? And so there are some specific challenges, I think, when you think about from a precision medicine, diagnostic medicine perspective, the type of data sets we work with, and the machine learning paradigms are very different from other aspects of healthcare. There is definitely a need for having linked records, longitudinal. I'm working with a couple different oncology projects right now in terms of how do we bring better insights to multidisciplinary teams is what Europeans kind of call it, tumor boards. But there's this paradigm that still hasn't really completely taken off in the US. But this idea of that, hey, you should have a more coordinated team making decisions, and not just in cancer. Right. I think in academic medicine, this happens quite often, right? You have conferences for metabolic diseases and for neuromuscular, skeletal. In general, medicine, community practice, it doesn't happen as much. But there is definitely a need there, a use case for helping to bring to those participants some insights that maybe the single radiologist who drew the last straw that had to prepare for the multidisciplinary team that week, maybe didn't fully pull from that patient's record, or the pathologist that has to describe with their hands in the conference, well, the cells look like this, right? And they can't actually look at the data. So there is this need for trying to mine, maybe find some signals in a record that, again, humans not good at looking at that trace. But to do that, to build those machine learning algorithms, you can't just take a bunch of data and scrub all the PHI out of them, and especially your service dates, right? You can't just say, hey, I have a whole bunch of records for random patients. We don't know anything about their demographics, their age, their comorbidities, right? So more and more this need for building advanced, or I would say even, somewhat useful machine learning, we have to think about, longitudinal linking, records. This is also leads to, I think, some of the the theses here. Well, why is it that a lot of these I call them first generation, AI applications? I think if you look in the data, there are about 145 quote unquote AI algorithm products the FDA has cleared over the last 3 to 4 years, right? And if you ask then, well, what's the market uptake of those? It's very different, right? And so I contend part of the reason too why there's some reticence or these solutions don't work. I mentioned one already, right, about the training paradigms, realization, reality. Another one is just if people making some of these products don't have a good grounding in understanding what problems should we try to solve with their technology, right? And this is where, again, you need a team of folks that understand what it is healthcare is supposed to be doing. What is the vocabulary? What's the language? I've worked in and around and in collaboration with at least 4 major medical device manufacturers, and I can count maybe on one hand the number of people in those organizations that know what a Quali is or a Dolly, because again, it's just not part of that culture, right? Of building software or hardware devices where you need to think about, well, what is it? What needs to be solved, right? Oftentimes the answer is, well, the marketing guys will tell us what's important, we'll build it, right? So again, I contend, especially for a data-driven technology embracing, you need a much different thought. You need to have a team informed and thinking about the value problem. And again, globally, right? This is data I pulled from the VizHub visualization of global burden of disease data. And just as a quick look here, if you look at the mortality data, cancer still a huge problem, right? But look at what's still killing so many people, right? Ischemic heart disease, stroke, non-communicable diseases and communicable diseases. So where in here, and globally speaking, where are there some areas, and especially look at the trends, what's happening over time, and disability adjusted life years, I think gives you another even more interesting kind of view in terms of building medical technologies, because now you have an argument you can start making about, okay, look, we're not just trying to make something we think is going to reduce death, but hey, we're going to make some impact on the economics and help the health systems, the broad health systems adapt and learn. And this gets back to understanding, I think, and mapping out and thinking through what are really the value chains. Not to sound like an MBA for a second, but this is really important, I think, and is sometimes missed in the product management. And especially I see this in small companies and startups and big companies, but really getting in and understanding the whole value flow. So in the case of radiology and imaging, it's like, okay, this all starts at somebody thinking that this patient could benefit from having some invisible either death rays or sound waves or something going through their body so we can help answer a question, right? And it ends with that information being turned into text going back to that physician or a group of physicians. And all the stuff we do along the way, all the technology, all the fast Fourier transforms, all the convolutional neural nets, decision for all that is really in that goal of trying to address that question and to increase that outcome, and at the same time minimizing some of the costs to do that. And the solution set to solving these problems, especially again, if you think about these global issues, I pull this up here because again, a lot of work have been doing is and still is in stroke management to make an effective stroke program, which by the way is a very good application for machine learning, and we're seeing that as well in terms of even some reimbursement patterns and the uptake of some solutions in the market. But if you think about how is it that you really want to address the disability adjusted life years, mortality for stroke management, you have to think about, well, there's more than just the data that's acquired during that diagnostic scan. There's that decision to call ambulance, or in some parts of the world they get wheeled in by their family members, right? And so each of these different capabilities need technology and also will benefit from technology. But at the same time, I love this quote, because we often, and I've seen this throughout my career, is we'll often try to over technologize maybe problems. I can't tell you how many companies I've seen in the last 20 years that have tried to, we're going to replace the whiteboard, right, in the operating suite or in the reading room or somewhere. At the end of the day, sometimes a marker and an eraser is just as good or as effective or better, right, than having to pay $50,000 to a vendor for software licenses, work with InfoSec, work with IT or CIOs, do training, right? So, again, it's about adding up all of those steps and all those thoughts. And again, these first generation algorithms we see coming into practice, whether they be in more medical applications as part of the EMR, but definitely the things that we see. And again, I'm using radiology as maybe as a launching pad, because again, we have evidence that we have a lot of activity and deployment of these solutions. But the problems are not just about getting some pixels into your convolutional neural net. It's about working across different patients. It's about now also rethinking the way we architect and deploy and bring out systems. So I would contend with this goal of, if we want to build learning health systems, you really need to have infrastructure and technologies and semantics and data models and the whole shebang, right, to really make this work. I use this as an example from where we've evolved in medical imaging from, hey, we used to have tape drives with old CT X-ray data on it, or big chunky hard drives, right? And today we have millions, if not billions, of images in repositories, petabytes of imaging data. But the issue is now, well, it's not so much about storing and persisting as, but how do we grab and bring insight out of this? So make an intelligent integrated diagnostics foundation takes, again, more though than just a database architect. It takes understanding of the problems. Where should we make these interfaces? Where and how do we use the right type of investments of automation, and where should it happen? And again, I steal this a little bit from the agile sort of world, right? From agile software management and development, that an intentional architecture evolves out of careful thinking and actually doing, right? That you want to intend what it is you want to architect, but as you go and build and test, you're going to discover then what really happens and is needed. And so at the bigger level, right? And again, I think in each of these little boxes and arrows, right, there are tons of master's theses, PhDs, papers, activities to happen. And again, it's the application of data sciences, machine learning, not just, again, sometimes we think it's about trying to find the tumor and say if it's cancerous, or find the subtle fracture, right? No, there is needs for proving the decision-making process across the whole continuum of care. Again, it's not just that technology problem, right? It takes clinical insight, it takes leadership, there takes then a need to get around some of these issues that are rightful issues in terms of data privacy and protections, and then just too, some of the practical issues of if you're trying to build a especially, use digital pathology, visible light imaging from H&E, you can have a pretty large data set. So do you really want to be sending, every time you want to train or even test somebody else's deep learning model on your H&E cohort? Do you want to be paying Amazon how many dollars per gigabyte or whatever it is? So one of the solutions for helping address this is this technique of federated learning, which again has been around from the general IT world, and some of the folks in Google and other places have kind of pioneered this. But the whole idea is that for diagnostic medicine in particular, we know the machine learning models to not overfit them, and also to not make them less brittle. We want more examples, we want more data, but we also don't want to be necessarily trying to spend 9 months bringing together a multi-site collaboration and contracts and IP. So federated learning is a technique to try to bring the algorithms to the data sets, using a toy example here, really, to kind of give an example or to talk about, well, what is it that federated learning can do, and why would we do it? So assume we have 3 sites. They want to collaborate on this awesome problem of the connection between IQ and pet ownership, but there's a prohibition on letting IQ values leave each university. Okay, well, how do we now work across these three sites? We essentially want to do a linear regression, but site 1 and site 2 can't put their data together, so we can just run them all in one, in one space. So the situation, we got data sets in site 1, we got site 2. So the most applicable paradigm for federated learning is, okay, well, in site 1, apply your algorithm, right? Granted, the mean square error and the formulation for linear regression doesn't lend itself for iterations. I get it. Again, it's just an idea. To replace this with an LM approach or something where you can do line search. I don't know. But the idea is okay, site 1 is going to do the fitting of their data, right? Okay, well, now site 2 has a different set of data. Maybe they have fewer data points. They don't have the same number of data, right? Well, they do their fitting there, and then site 3, okay, hey, different set of data, we do our analysis. And then now what federated learning is about is, well, instead of trying to pull all these data up to some cloud or central server, what you're doing is at each iteration, each training epoch of your algorithm, you share up into the central place the coefficients. So in this case, for linear model, right, simply the A, the B coefficients. And then up here, you do some then mathematical operation. The state of the art, so to speak, is federated averaging, which, kind of like most things, averaging tends to work. But again, this is a very active area of needed development and innovation. But so the coefficients are pooled, averaged, and then you send back to each site this now new global coefficient set, AM, BM, and then you iterate again, right? And so the theory being that when you're done iterating at each of these sites, you're going to end up with a global model. Now, assuming your assumptions are proper, right, or appropriate, that the global model, there is a linear relationship in this case between IQ and PET. The data are not too collinear, right? So again, there are all those assumptions we tend to sometimes just gloss over in estimation theory. These become much more acute in federated learning, right? Which is again a very active area of research and needed. But the idea though is this is a way of getting you to get towards a more global model without having to share and push the data all over the place. From more of a functional perspective, right? This is this idea that the notion there is some central controller that is really controlling command and heartbeat. In reality, for most convolutional neural nets, right, it's not even the weights and coefficients that are shared. Sometimes the gradients are pushed back up. Then there's reconciliation. Yes, there are theoretical and practical potential privacy issues there. You can take from gradients, for instance, and do some manipulation, get back the data. But that's where there, well, hey, okay, fine, do some point-to-point encryption or do differential privacy of the coefficient transfers. But again, that's also a good area of research and needed. Coming to the end of the time here, but just putting this up to as a proof point that the stuff really can work in reality. This is work that my colleagues at the Mass General Brigham, again, when I was associated with the Center for Clinical Data Science during COVID, like everybody in the world, everybody was, hey, let's solve COVID problems. But the opportunity that arose here was the guys at MGH developed a risk prediction score, multimodal, right? So not just based on X-ray, CT, but also some clinical features. It was pretty decent, right? Both in the Brigham and also over at MGH. But then other sites wanted to use it, right? So just informally, a site tried it in the UK. Oh, this thing sucks, right? So that was then, okay, the same realization we had doing some of this large scale industrial academic work at MGH. Hey, if we can federate these groups together, if we can do a means of not having to move data, do data sharing agreements with 3 different continents, 4 continents would be awesome. NVIDIA was interested in this, so they funded 20 sites to come together to take this initial MGH train model, deploy it at about 20 locations around the world, and then retrain it. And so this was recently published in Nature Medicine. A number of my colleagues and friends, co-authors. And there are many federated learning, imaging, and radiology, and even healthcare papers that are published that are mostly simulation papers. This is one of the biggest, most comprehensive one that actually is, based in real life and real data, and it's a very good read. And so let me jump to this real quick. I promise I'll wrap up here. Where this paradigm of distributed compute, because again, I'd like to talk about not just federated learning, but the notion is if you can do federated learning at scale, if you can do this privacy preserving work, it opens up a whole lot of new opportunities, especially when you see some of the issues that, again, we know that is a problem in supervised machine learning and the overfitting and brittleness. And then this whole issue of like, well, hey, who's accountable for actually taking, in this case, this is work that was done at Stanford, Michigan, using one of Epic's sepsis models and finding out, oh, hey, it took 9 months of tweaking and re-optimizing when we deployed this into our setting. There were some clinical medical issues. The sepsis scores are different. They're used, right? So the thought process here is if you can make a federated environment, you can start to address some of these issues, not only just when you're building the model, but also from a deployment and going to the real world model stuff. I can give a whole other 45-minute lecture just on regulatory streams and issues and concerns. But real quick, for the most part, of the AI algorithms you see in diagnostic medicine, they are automatically, in a sense, class 2 medical devices. So the regulatory pathway is somewhat clear, right? How do you do it? There's some differences, but for the most part, I mentioned these 140 or so AI algorithms have been cleared. Most of them are predicated, their clinical performance, doing multi-reader, multi-center trials, reader studies, right? But the algorithm then gets shipped and mailed, or not mailed, that gets deployed, is that version of the model that went through that MRMC. If you want to now change it, if you want to update that convolutional neural net, well, hey, there's some challenges, catastrophic forgetting, and what sort of enrichment do you do? Well, assume you figure that out. Well, now you got to go and somehow deploy this in each of your 1,500 sites, or in the case of things associated with scanners, thousands of places. The other issue is, how do you even do surveillance? How do you know when this machine learning algorithm is not working well? How do you then isolate images or data points or waveforms at the facility that you should use in updating or retraining? Without having some sort of a federated distributed network, that becomes very challenging. So arguably, by having a federation, by having privacy preserving ways of talking, communicating to reduce some of the contractual obligations, we should be able to do surveillance more easily. We should be able to do deployment, updating of even some of the classic, CNNs and other machine learning models. And lastly, I think this speaks then to some of the real opportunities. Again, a lot of lessons that I've learned from working very deeply in establishing contracts and doing co-creation work with academic, medical institutions, researchers. We need to, there's a cultural difference, right? There's usually that challenge of, okay, hey, look, I'm trying to discover new things, solve problems. I'm not so much concerned about what the FDA thinks or what engineering is going to do. But in my experience is that view needs to change a bit, right? Then on the industry side, innovator side, you though also have to try to understand, like, well, what is the value really that your clinical colleagues, your partner, your true partner is going to be? We're in a different era now where you just don't write a check to the physics lab and say, go build us a surface coil and do some phantom work, and cool, we'll take your MATLAB code and off we go, right? These are dynamic, living, breathing algorithms. So we need to understand on the industry side, what is it that, how do physicians think, how do health systems work, what are their challenges, what should they bring to the partnership, because again, we need that joint approach to test, deploy, and enrich and bring to life, these innovations that potentially have a lot of value. Because this little box here is something that, again, has come up in a lot of the experiences I have. It's like, hey, you guys, the product people, we're academic researchers. We know some guys in the business development group somewhere said we're going to partner and share IP, but that's their problem. I'm incentivized by publishing and getting tenure, right? So it's a very delicate area, but again, I think it gets back to understanding what it is that you can gain and glean from what you can only know from living inside the health system, right? This is an example of some of this X-ray automation work been involved in. You don't get this by having two product people go into two hospitals, right? You need people in the trenches. You need partners, collaborators. You also then need to have folks that understand what are some of the unique, really, data assets that you could use and should use to solve some problems. And I bring this up as my closing example, because this is an example again of work that I was still involved in with colleagues up at Mass General, the Brigham, on stroke detection. This algorithm here, what we did is not the most sophisticated neural net. It's a fairly basic, UNet, maybe a YNet with some, dependencies pushed in. But what was really different here, medically speaking, is the Mass General Brigham has been doing diffusion weighted imaging. So essentially they've been doing MRI on all their stroke patients for the last 10 years. Right. And if you know anything about MR physics and stroke, blah, 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 diffusion weighted imaging is essentially the gold standard for finding out where there is dead tissue or dying tissue in the brain. So we were able to use that overlaid with CT information from the same patients to build a model to say, hey, algorithm, find in the non-contrast CT, which is a much simpler, much dirtier scan based on this information you get from the very, very ground truth on that patient, help us find where we think this actual core of the stroke is. And these results have been extremely encouraging, and very powerful, because the idea here from a health economic perspective is you can make a decision. You could see from a much less expensive technology, CT, non-contrast CT, you can get similar insight that you would get from $1 million MR scanner, right? And so this is, again, this idea would not have happened without the involvement of neuroradiologists, neurologists, a custom data set, and bring it together to also overlay it with the problem that needs to be solved globally. And it's not just a point problem. So that's my story. Again, could go on a number of these other dimensions. Again, I didn't really go too deep into some of the theoretic and machine learning stuff. Again, happy to do some of those, and some other prognostication on where I think things should go. But very much appreciate your time. And I know how valuable everybody's time is. And thank you. So I guess, Adrian, back to you.
Fantastic, John. That was great. That was a tour de force of, quite a diverse array of subjects. If you want to share, can you stop sharing your screen and then we can see everyone? That would be great. We can either take questions in the chat, and there's already a few quotes saying excellent and thank you, John, or you can raise your hand or you can unmute yourself. I will take the pleasure of taking the first question. I think a lot of people are somewhat frustrated by the lack of progress, and you kind of highlighted this at the start. Depends what the term progress is. And I want to ask you about the Dr. House example. So you ended that, and I was wondering what you would say is the reason why we haven't made that much progress in that complex example of radiology imaging. Mm-hmm. And I think your answer was, it's quite complex, and it's in a healthcare system, and it's regulated, etc. Mm. And I'm not too satisfied with that answer, because we landed a man on the moon about 50 years ago, and I currently drive a car that's semi-automated. It can somewhat drive by itself, but it's not very good. And so I wonder, is that the reason, or is it that the healthcare system hasn't seen value in this data and hasn't invested in systems that could do it, because this not being able to get the data is the impingement to machine learning and AI. Yeah, if you don't have the data, you can't do that. Yeah,
right.
What is the barrier? Why haven't we made progress in that?
Yeah, well, and it definitely is starting to change, right? I would say, if even so, we were talking before before we started here about the RSNA. I think a lot of the sketches and architectural renderings, even aspirations we had at UPMC and in the old Technology Development Center, we are starting to see some of these realizations in the latest software offerings from both smaller vendors and bigger vendors. Yeah. And I think health systems are starting to embrace them. There's an interesting socioeconomic piece here. So I think for about 10 years in the US, there was so much, I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I mean, it's good. We have digitized health records, but there was so much emphasis in getting EMRs deployed, EHR systems in, deploying them, that we are kind of coming out of that hangover, right? And so now CIOs, CMIOs in the last 3-4 years are now finally, okay, what do we do with all these other systems, right? And what's the value prop? But I still think there is, though, this underlying piece, which gets back to the academic medicine, the need for value. Well, for so many years, especially in diagnostic imaging, we got away with, hey, our thing spins faster and you get better isotropic resolution. But then the question is, well, does that matter? Right. So there is some of that as well, right? Which I think then gets back to the value proposition, the economics. Well, is it worth paying another $3 million for this new improved, nuclear medicine, hybrid, blah, 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 if like what we have is okay enough, and how do we know the difference, right? Because in diagnostics, same as true in pathology, there's a whole health economic, literature base here. How do you demonstrate value of diagnostics? It's not easy, right? Because so many of their decisions are made downstream. There are so many other chances for things to go wrong. So it's sometimes difficult to argue, because I've been in these rooms, these boardrooms, or helping my commercial colleagues. How do you argue to make an investment of large amount of money when it's like, well, hey, we're good, right?
Yeah. Okay, we have a couple of questions. So Pradeep, you can ask yours. If you unmute yourself. Okay, we'll go to
Shandong. Thank you.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry, there was a difficulty to unmute.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Kalafut. This is a great talk. I really enjoyed that quote from NASA you put in. That's making me question a whole lot of things. So basically, following up on Dr. Lee's comment, I wanted to basically mention that a lot of these efforts are focused so narrowly that either they're not applicable in the actual translational side, or the problems themselves are quite an open challenge even for academics, right? So I was wondering if you wanted to comment on which, I think you kind of touched upon it in some sense, which problems are really solvable or open, which problems are actually translatable, etc. Right? So I was gonna kind of answer Adrian with saying we didn't make progress because we don't have solutions. What do you think?
Yeah, that's so that's where I mentioned some of these operational, ideas. And so even so, back when I started getting involved in radiation dose tracking, dose management, it was a difficult sell to health systems. They'd be like, well, who cares, right? Then all of a sudden, oh crap, we're burning people's hairs off with CT scanners because we're not measuring anything, right? So, so sometimes it takes an externality to make people, and I mentioned that because that really is an operational problem, right? And so there are ways of addressing and doing machine learning and applying, you don't even need to use machine learning, just use some good old basic, statistics. And so sometimes those problems get missed because it's easier, right, doing voice of customer to talk to the radiologist or surgeon. Like, well, yeah, I patients come in, I don't care, right? Somebody takes care of that. So those, some of those problems are definitely tractable and are needed. And this gets back to the whole value quotient. There is a whole other, I think, discussions, gets back to some of Adrian's questions. Some of these easier problems to solve for both pathologists, radiologists, oncologists. The challenge is you really need to be sometimes in the bowels of the information system that the physician is using. right? It's much, and then this speaks the need for better interoperability, whether it's some of the work from fire, and we used to have CCAL, right? That was a disaster, right? But the issue is, unless you're Epic, for instance, not to pick on Epic, but if you're Epic or Cerner, it's a hell of a lot easier to bring these innovations into the desktop than it is if you're 3 guys in Canada that have a cool idea, right? Because doctors, like any knowledge worker, right? You don't want to be picking up your cell phone while you're logged into an EMR, then open a web browser, right? So there are some fundamental IT network interop challenges, I think, that do inhibit some of this, especially in healthcare. That again is a whole other discussion, but yeah.
Fantastic. And so we have a question from Shandong Wu.
Okay.
Hi, John.
Shandong.
Nice to see you here. Yeah, this is wonderful talk, a lot of insights. I also want to follow up the first question Adrian was asking. I want to share one thought here. I think the value here is this.
Oh, Shandong, we lost you.
Hear me now?
Yeah.
You hear me now? Okay, yeah. Think about a new treatment or a new medicine, right? So we do clinical trial to show that there's added value, there's a benefit on that, and then we take action on here. I think the key for AI to have value, to really gain trust or gain people to start use it or even purchase it, is that we need a prospective study, clinical trial, to show really the AI will make a difference, will add value to the patient care. Right now, there's a lot of hopes, but we have to really see the data to supporting that. And there's single-centered data or retro studies. These are not enough. There's a recent paper in Science showing that a lot of study in the retrospective evaluation, when they are translated to real-world prospective evaluation for cancer treatment, a lot of solutions are not working from the AI generated solutions. It doesn't work. So we really need a prospective study to show that. And unfortunately, I think there are some ongoing prospective AI studies. I think in Europe, there are 2 studies on breast imaging, breast cancer studies. I think that's really the trials or study we're looking at, and we want to see the results. And I can imagine if these kind of studies are published, with the benefit of that, it will be a big effort. It will be a big motivation and data supporting us to start to really, move this forward and translate to the clinical setting, right? So that's my answer to that question. So I also question to John, to you is you talked about a lot of today I think FDA already cleared more than 140 software, AI software got cleared already. So in many of those areas or AI software you have seen based on your experience, which areas or which system or which organs, areas or modalities, where you think there could be the first few that could potentially shows the value, because we know some product it will have values, but you think which area could it be that kind of a model or system that can show this potential?
Sure, and yeah, I talked a bit. That's one of the reasons I picked some of the stroke work is doing. So I think neuro is really an area where, again, and some of the reasons there is a reimbursement pathway for these automated, what's called large vessel occlusion algorithms, right, where you can find the blockage, because it ties directly to a clinical impact, right? How do you more quickly, without needing an expert radiologist at that point of care, to make a determination that this patient is a candidate for revascularization, right? So the algorithms to do some of that assessment aren't necessarily the most complicated, right? But it fits within this pathway that we could really cause some impact. And it builds upon, again, the medical, the hard work from the RCTs, from the neuro, the interventional community, cardiovascular. There's some good work and things out there in terms of making more quantitative estimates. There is enough interest in good technology out there in breast that, there's still this hangover from the first generation of breast CAD, where most diagnostic radiologists are like, but there are some really creative techniques that are being taken in new workflows. Then lastly, again, this whole area of quantitative imaging is doing things in oncology for reducing the need of measuring things manually, right? Having repeatability, which also ties into radiation therapy. So I think breast, neuro, heart, parts of oncology, radiation therapy, we know that that's where quasi-objectively too, I'm seeing most evidence that's being created and also interest in the marketplace.
All right, thank you very much, John. Thank you for that.
Okay, John, we're just after 5, so I think we will call it there. I think thank you for giving the seminar. I think thanks for taking the questions. I think everyone was trying to suck information from you as you're the ball that's going to give us the answer to the greatest area. So thanks for doing that. We truly appreciate it. And everyone, John is in town, and so if anyone needs help or support, I'm sure he's around.
Definitely. Yes, and over here in Mount Lebanon. So
okay. Thank you, John. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you. It's a wonderful talk. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. All right. Cheers.